Look at the world around you. The sheer, staggering diversity of life. The predator perfectly adapted to hunt with lethal precision. The prey perfectly camouflaged to hide in the shadows. The absolute greatest biological revelation in human history is the realization that life is not static. Species change, adapt, and evolve over millions of years to survive the brutal, unforgiving realities of their environment. When you picture the genius who first looked at nature and unlocked this world-shattering epiphany, who do you picture? You are taught to revere the British naturalist Charles Darwin. You picture him standing on the deck of the HMS Beagle in the 19th century, observing finches in the remote Galapagos Islands. You are told that Darwin, through his isolated, unparalleled genius, single-handedly dragged humanity out of the dark ages of religious dogma and creationism. We are taught that before 1859, the entire world was completely blind to the mechanics of nature, until the West alone figured out the true, dynamic origins of life. But the absolute foundational blueprint for natural selection was not drafted in 19th century London. The profound concept of the struggle for existence was not coined on a British naval ship, and the realization that environmental factors force species to adapt and pass those survival traits to their offspring was not discovered during the Victorian era. The exact philosophical and biological framework for evolutionary theory was engineered over 1,000 years earlier by an Afro-Arab scholar observing the brutal food chains in the bustling markets of Iraq. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the evolution heist and how a 9th century Muslim polymath actually discovered natural selection. What follows is the story of a massive scientific blind spot and one of the most blatant acts of academic erasure the Western biological establishment absolutely does not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who refuses to accept the heavily curated, highly sanitized historical narratives handed to you in school, if you want to know the actual, hidden architects of modern science, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us begin with the official timeline of biology. The version of natural history you were tested on, which meticulously paints Europe as the sole, undisputed pioneer of secular, rational science. According to the Western narrative, the story of biology before the mid-19th century was an intellectual wasteland. For centuries, you are told, the entire world believed in a strict, unyielding version of static creationism. The European scientific and religious establishments universally operated under a concept known as the Great Chain of Being. They believed that every single animal on Earth was created exactly as it currently exists, placed in a strict hierarchy that could never be altered. They believed nature was frozen in time. A lion was always a lion, a finch was always a finch, and the environment had absolutely no power to alter the physical form or behavior of a living creature. The extinction of a species was considered impossible, and the adaptation of a species was considered heresy. The standard textbook narrative tells us that this rigid, dogmatic paralysis blinded human intellect. Europe boldly declares that the monumental transition from superstitious creationism to the rational evolutionary science of biology is the pure, unadulterated invention of the European mind. They draw a straight, unbroken line from the dark ages of biology directly to Charles Darwin, completely ignoring a massive, glaring, 1,000-year gap in the timeline of human observation. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the biological encyclopedias written a millennium before the HMS Beagle ever set sail, and if you read the exact Arabic phrases describing environmental adaptation and survival, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western biological genius completely shatters. To find the true pioneer of evolutionary biology, we have to completely abandon the prestigious scientific academies of 19th century Britain. We have to travel back in time, over 1,000 years before Darwin was even born. We have to travel to the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, the massive, thriving intellectual hub of Basra in southern Iraq in the 9th century. In the 800s, while Europe was locked in a static, unchanging view of the universe, the Islamic world was driven by a completely different philosophy. Guided by the desire to understand the intricate mechanics of creation, Islamic scholars did not just read ancient philosophical texts, they rigorously observed the physical world. And operating in this vibrant intellectual ecosystem was a brilliant polymath named Abu Uthman Amr ibn Bar al-Kinani, universally known to history as Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz was not an aristocratic European gentleman observing nature as a leisurely hobby. He was the grandson of an East African slave. He rose from absolute poverty in the bustling port city of Basra to become one of the most prolific, brilliant, and revered intellectuals in the history of the Islamic Golden Age. He was a man deeply embedded in the chaotic, diverse reality of the physical world. Al-Jahiz completely rejected the European idea that nature was a static, unchanging museum exhibit. He did not look at animals as isolated, permanent statues placed randomly on the earth. He looked at them as dynamic, struggling participants in a massive, interconnected web of life, death, and survival. He spent decades meticulously observing animals, insects, and their environments. He watched how predators hunted. He watched how prey evaded capture. He observed the brutal, unforgiving realities of the food chain in the deserts and rivers of the Middle East. He recognized something profound that the West would not realize for another 10 centuries. The environment was not just a passive backdrop. It was an active, merciless force that dictated exactly who lived and who died. He took these revolutionary, perception-altering observations and compiled them into a colossal, multi-volume masterpiece called Kitab al-Hayawan, or the Book of Animals. This was not a simple catalog of myths or a basic medieval bestiary. It was a rigorous, highly detailed encyclopedia of zoology, animal behavior, and environmental biology. He wrote extensively about the social organization of ants, the communication of animals, and the profound effects of climate on living creatures. And inside the pages of this massive 9th-century text, Al-Jahiz was about to write something that would completely destroy the Western monopoly on the origins of life. He was about to explicitly map out the absolute core engine of evolutionary theory, a staggering 10 centuries before the Western world claimed to have discovered it. Inside the pages of the Book of Animals, Al-Jahiz achieved something that shatters the entire timeline of Western biology. Centuries before the European scientific establishment even possessed a vocabulary for environmental adaptation, Al-Jahiz explicitly detailed the mechanics of evolution. He did not just describe animals eating each other. He coined the exact conceptual framework of the struggle for existence. He wrote, explicitly, that animals are engaged in a relentless, brutal struggle for resources, for food, and to avoid being eaten themselves. He noted that every single species, from the smallest insect to the largest apex predator, is locked in this permanent biological war for survival. He became the first scientist in recorded history to systematically map out the biological food chain. He observed that rats eat insects, snakes eat rats, and birds of prey eat snakes. But he went significantly further than simple observation. He attached this food chain directly to the concept of physical adaptation. Al-Jahiz realized that to survive this brutal, unforgiving struggle, animals had to physically adapt to their specific environments. He wrote that environmental factors, the extreme climate, the scarcity of food, the geographic isolation of an ecosystem, physically force species to develop new traits. He observed that the animals that successfully develop these advantageous traits survive the environmental gauntlet, while those that fail to adapt simply perish. But his absolute greatest biological breakthrough was recognizing the biological engine of heredity. He explicitly stated that the animals that survive this struggle pass their successful, adapted traits down to their offspring, fundamentally altering the species over successive generations. Let the absolute magnitude of that biological breakthrough sink in. The struggle for existence, environmental adaptation, the passing of advantageous traits to offspring to ensure the survival of the species. He was literally describing the exact, fundamental mechanics of natural selection. He was writing the physical, philosophical manual for evolutionary biology. He was utilizing the exact biological framework that Charles Darwin would claim to have miraculously invented a staggering 1,000 years later in London. And Al-Jahiz's brilliant theories were not just confined to a single dusty manuscript in Iraq. They became the absolute foundation of Islamic biological science. His theories on evolution were taught, studied, and expanded upon by generations of Islamic polymaths. The great 11th century philosopher Ibn Miskawayh explicitly wrote about the evolutionary progression of life, describing how matter evolved from minerals, to plants, to animals, and finally to primates and humans. The legendary historian Ibn Khaldun wrote in his famous 14th century text, the Muqaddimah, that the animal world widened and gradually progressed to the stage of man, having the power to think and reflect, explicitly noting the biological link between apes and humans centuries before Europe stopped believing the earth was flat. Even the famous poet Rumi wrote profound verses about the evolution of life from inorganic matter to conscious humanity. They took the chaotic, terrifying mysteries of nature and subjected them to rational, observational, evolutionary science. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the Victorian scientific revolution. If the exact mechanics of natural selection, the struggle for existence, environmental adaptation, and the biological progression of species were all established, documented, and actively taught in the Islamic world starting in the 9th century, how did a British naturalist in 1859 get all the credit? How did the West successfully execute this massive scientific cover-up, claiming they invented evolutionary theory out of thin air in the 19th century? To answer that terrifying question, we have to completely dismantle the myth of the isolated Victorian genius. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured academic extraction network of the British and French empires. You are taught that Charles Darwin's discovery was a closed intellectual loop. You are told that he stepped off the HMS Beagle, looked at a finch, and spontaneously invented the concept of evolution from his own isolated intellect. The Western narrative violently insists that the architecture of natural selection is a purely European invention, completely untainted by the outside world. But the academic and geopolitical reality of the 19th century destroys that myth completely. By the 1800s, the British and French empires were not just militarily occupying the Middle East and North Africa, they were aggressively extracting its intellectual wealth. European universities in London, Paris, and Berlin were flooded with Orientalists, highly funded academic scholars entirely dedicated to translating Arabic, Persian, and Islamic scientific texts into European languages. The Victorian scientific establishment was not blind to Islamic biology. In fact, they were intimately, heavily familiar with it. Decades before Charles Darwin ever published On the Origin of Species, European academics were already widely discussing the evolutionary theories of Al-Jahiz, Ibn Miskawayh, and Ibn Khaldun. The concept of species adapting over time and progressing from lower forms of life to higher forms was not a shocking new idea to the European academic elite. It was literally known and referred to in European academic circles at the time as the Mohammedan theory of evolution. The Western scientific elite were fully, consciously aware that the philosophical and biological framework of species adaptation already existed in the East. John William Draper, a prominent 19th century scientist and contemporary of Darwin, explicitly acknowledged the Mohammedan theory of the evolution of man from lower forms, or his gradual development to his present condition in the long lapse of time. The knowledge that species evolved, struggled, and adapted was not invented by the Victorian scientific establishment. It was actively imported from the very translated Islamic texts sitting in their prestigious university libraries. But the Western academic establishment had a major, terrifying ideological problem. They were building a massive, globe-spanning empire justified entirely by the racist, supremacist ideology that the white, Christian European mind was the absolute pinnacle of human evolution and rational thought. They were aggressively colonizing the globe, claiming to bring scientific light to the backward, primitive East. They could not publicly admit that the greatest, most advanced, most paradigm-shattering biological science in human history was actually engineered by an Afro-Arab Muslim polymath from the very regions they were attempting to conquer. It would completely destroy their fragile narrative of Western intellectual dominance. So, they engaged in a deliberate, highly calculated process of academic erasure. When Western historians of science compiled the definitive timeline of biology, they executed a massive, deliberate historical blind spot. They drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greek philosophers directly to the Victorian naturalists of the 19th century, completely skipping over the 1,000 years of highly advanced, heavily documented Islamic evolutionary biology. They took figures like Al-Jahiz, a man who had literally written the world's first physical manuscript, detailing environmental adaptation and the struggle for existence, and relegated his work to obscurity. If they mentioned him at all, they dismissed him as a mere translator of Greek myths, completely ignoring his absolute mastery over the mechanics of nature. This massive, highly successful historical erasure set the perfect stage for the ultimate biological heist. By the time 1859 arrived, the West had completely convinced itself that they were the undisputed pioneers of rational science. Let us look at Charles Darwin, the legendary figure universally worshipped by Western textbooks as the sole father of evolutionary theory. We are told that Darwin's On the Origin of Species was a completely isolated, uniquely Western intellectual miracle. We are told he was the first scientist to realize that species compete for resources, that the environment selects the strongest, and that traits are passed down to ensure survival. Western history treats this as a miraculous, unprecedented leap in human evolution. But if you actually look at the conceptual framework of Darwin's theory, the illusion of an entirely new science completely evaporates. Charles Darwin was undeniably a brilliant observer and a meticulous data collector. What Darwin achieved was providing massive, overwhelming empirical, physical, and geological evidence for evolution. He collected the finches, he studied the fossils, and he mapped the physical proof across continents. But Charles Darwin did not invent the concept of evolution. He did not invent the concept of the food chain. He did not invent the concept of environmental adaptation. And he certainly did not invent the phrase or the mechanical reality of the struggle for existence. The fundamental realization that life is a brutal competition and that nature actively forces species to adapt or die is the exact, fundamental concept that Al-Jahiz established in Basra a millennium prior. Darwin did not invent natural selection. He simply proved it. He took the exact biological blueprint that an Afro-Arab polymath had already written, populated it with massive amounts of Victorian empirical data, packaged it for a European audience, and passed the core concept off as the spontaneous invention of the modern Western mind. The Western pioneers of biology were undeniably influential, but they were not the architects. They were the inheritors of a massive, heavily translated, highly advanced Islamic scientific legacy. The Western biological establishment did not invent evolutionary theory. They simply utilized the intellectual framework of the Islamic Golden Age, applied their own physical evidence, and then had the absolute arrogance to claim they had invented the very concept of biology. Do you see the absolute arrogance of the Heist? First, they translated the Arabic encyclopedias and absorbed the Mohammedan theory of evolution into their universities. Then, they used that exact philosophical framework to structure their own physical observations. And finally, when the brilliance of the science became the undisputed foundation of the modern world, they simply erased the Afro-Arab grandson of a slave from the timeline of human discovery, passing off his genius as the miraculous invention of a British gentleman. They took the absolute foundation of modern biology, smashed the Arabic name off the laboratory door, and slapped a European patent on it. They built the modern scientific world on a stolen blueprint. Today, we live in a world completely dictated by evolutionary science. We build massive, multi-billion-dollar natural history museums. We rely on the clinical understanding of viral adaptation, genetics, and evolutionary biology to navigate modern medicine and agriculture. We sit in university biology classes and nod along as professors praise the unique, unparalleled, isolated genius of the Victorian scientific awakening. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness of religious creationism and figured out how to safely navigate the true origins of life. But the modern biological mind was not born on the deck of a British naval ship. The mechanical reality of environmental adaptation was not discovered in the Galapagos Islands. The absolute foundation of the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by an Afro-Arab scholar in 9th-century Iraq. Modern evolutionary biology is not a spontaneous European miracle. It is a massive, highly successful scientific heist. The West didn't invent natural selection. They simply walked into an Islamic intellectual library, copied the biological manuals, finally observed the physical evidence for themselves, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented nature itself. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable physical reality of Al-Jahiz's 9th-century manuscript, the Book of Animals, is sitting right there in the historical archives. The exact, flawless clinical articulation of the struggle for existence, environmental adaptation, and food chains centuries before Europe even understood the concept is an undisputed historical fact. The undeniable existence of European academics actively discussing the Islamic theories of evolution decades before Darwin published his book is a matter of absolute physical record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of evolutionary biology and the discoverer of natural selection deliberately kept out of your textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the history of biology, the birth of evolutionary theory, and the myth of Western scientific supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.